Good afternoon. Thanks for everyone for coming. Today I'm going to talk about work that's collaborative with Claire Tsai, Golden Oakman, Raina Wang, and Minwen Yang. And it's very much So I want to start off with thinking about the importance of hypothesis generation across medicine, across science, across criminal work, or even getting your car repaired. And I think a great example of this is in 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak. So in 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in the Soho neighborhood in London. 600 people had died. The general kind of theory underlying why cholera was afflicting people in this neighborhood was miasma, which is the idea at the time people believed that rotting organic matter, could it be a cemetery, it could be from a butcher, would cause the disease. And so they thought that what they needed to do was better ventilate homes and businesses in the area. This was incredibly ineffective. And it was only when Jon Snow, not the Game of Thrones character, but an early epidemiologist, traced the cholera outbreak to the Broad Street water pump, did people realize that cholera was a digestive waterborne disease, and they were able to stop its spread by removing the handle to the pump. So we can see here that without the right or correct hypotheses, people have difficulty often engaging in ways or actions that are beneficial, whether it's dealing with the disease or thinking about other kinds of projects. You can see in general, hypothesis generation tends to be less studied than other aspects of decision-making under certainty, but it's an early and crucial first step in thinking about how to solve problems, and it often acts as a ceiling on the quality of decisions that you can make. So we think about how people make decisions under uncertainty. Typically, they start by generating a series of plausible hypotheses. They assess the plausibility of a subset of those hypotheses and then test them. Many of us are familiar with this in the scientific process. Our doctors do it when making medical diagnoses. Our mechanics do it when they're thinking about why our car is working the way it does. And in the criminal justice system, it's a similar kind of process for thinking about whom should be considered for criminal charges. So in general, hypothesis generation improves decision-making. Generating an exhaustive set of hypotheses is very helpful because it gets you to consider both reasons for and reasons against hypotheses. And they also impose a ceiling on decision quality. So often thinking about a single faulty hypothesis can be worse than having no hypothesis at all. You can think about some examples of the decision to invade Iraq, the decision to charge the Central Park 5, or like the urban renewal project in Boston with Raise the West End. I'm not sure if there's any Boston historians here, but it's really tragic. Okay, so there's sort of three general kinds of constraints on hypothesis generation. One is you simply don't know enough to generate hypotheses, but we see that even experts from doctors and mechanics tend to only consider a subset of plausible hypotheses. Another is limited working memory. So often when we're thinking about potential causes, things that are more recently considered come to mind. So for example, doctors, when they make errors, tend to err in diagnosing you in the same way that they recently diagnosed the previous patient. So there's this accessibility bias. And then a major driver is cognitive effort. So thinking about hypotheses is effortful to do. And so people tend to stop generating hypotheses once they have a hypothesis that is good enough. And this is called satisficing in the behavioral economics literature. And you can think about an example of this is that most consumers don't price shop. They tend to go to one website when they're making purchases. So I think many of us are guilty of just going to Amazon and like finding a particular thing without checking on Google Shopping whether or not we could get it elsewhere cheaper. Okay, so in terms of existing interventions, they tend to be either costly or ineffective. So if you use incentives or crowdsourcing, they tend to increase the hypotheses generated by the group. So the whole crowd might generate more hypotheses, but you don't see individual group members generating more hypotheses on their own. And in medical kinds of contexts, long training sessions and large incentives can work, but those are extremely difficult to scale. So if we're getting people to think about generating more hypotheses, having them undergo a 1-hour training session for each kind of problem that they encounter is practically infeasible for most cases. So we wanted to see whether or not we could use large language models to increase hypothesis generation. They're trained on a large corpus of human knowledge, such as Wikipedia and Reddit, resources like those that you can access with search engines and other kinds of techniques. And they tend to quickly organize and synthesize knowledge which should reduce cognitive effort. And as an example, so professional writers who use ChatGPT-3 didn't necessarily write better kinds of pieces, but it took them about half the time to write when they were using LLM to produce professional writing. So our experimental method, we used a number of experiments that have a very similar structure, and I'll explain sort of why we chose this. So we had participants who were sports fans use LLMs or other resources, search engines and the internet, to predict which Major League Baseball or NFL teams would make the playoffs as of that date, right? And so we have an objective criteria here, which is like the Vegas betting odds to see if they were able to generate teams that were probable to win the hypothesis, the playoffs. This is the nice kind of, it's a couple of nice features. One is it encourages people to generate multiple hypotheses because 12 of the 30 MLB teams or 14 of the 32 NFL teams make the playoffs each year. It controls for memory because people can just copy and paste the results from search engines or from the LLMs. It controls for knowledge. Everyone has access to all teams and betting odds. It's very easy to look this up. And the LLMs that we use were either Google Bard or Perplexity because they were able to incorporate that new data. There's some LLMs that don't have access to like 2024 data. Okay, so our predictions were that participants would be using LLMs would generate more hypotheses or teams than participants who did not use LLMs due to the reduction in cognitive effort required to generate the hypotheses. And then I'll go back at the end of this results and show you a couple of robustness checks. So we look at also percentage of accurate hypotheses, the total number of accurate hypotheses, with and without pre-registered exclusions. So we did not tell people explicitly in the non-LLM conditions to not use LLMs, but then we afterwards asked them if they did and removed them as pre-registered. We also look at generalization across gender and also the effects of LLM output accuracy. So we did not tell people what prompts to use. All the prompts that they generated are organic, and that creates substantial variation in the data. We did use some knowledge filters to make sure that people had a basic understanding of the sport. So for example, in the MLB studies, we asked people how many players are required in the outfield, what does OBP mean, how many innings constitute a standard MLB game, how many teams are eligible to make the playoffs, which sort of as a reminder, what's the name of the trophy that Super Bowl winners receive. Until recently, we received the Lombardi Trophy pretty often here. And the offense has 4 what to gain 10 yards, downs, tosses, or tackles. I'm sure many of us can pass this right here today. Okay, so in our 2 experiments to just test the focal effect, we're looking at either the MLB playoffs from 2024 with Perplexity AI or the NFL 2024 playoffs with Google Bard. And I just want to show you, we have a non-LLM condition and an LLM condition. These are violin plots that tell you about the means, the 95% confidence intervals, and you can see the shape of the distribution. But basically, you can see that people generate more hypotheses, almost twice as many hypotheses when they're using an LLM as not using an LLM. Again, folks in a non-LLM condition can use search engines like Google, Bing, whatever. They're able to visit any site that they want to. The LLM condition, they're just simply directed to start with an LLM. Okay. We replicate that basic effect in the 2024 NFL playoffs as well. We see almost a doubling of teams generated with the use of LLMs relative to the no LLM condition. And then we wanted to see in the 3rd experiment whether it's really about cognitive effort. And so to do this, what we did was we incentivized participants in an incentives condition where they were paid 10 cents for each correct prediction. We didn't specify exactly how we're going to do that, but the idea is if it's really just about, if we're really controlling for knowledge, we're really controlling for memory, if we give people a financial incentive, then people who aren't using an LLM should look much like people who do, right? If that's all the LLM is doing, is making it easier for them to generate team names, then paying them for a team name should wipe out that kind of effect. And that's exactly what we find. We have unincentivized conditions in blue, incentivized conditions in, okay, so there it is, tangerine. Okay, and so you can see is in the unincentivized no LLM condition, people generate fewer team names. If we give people in the no LLM condition a 10-cent incentive for each team name that they are correct about, then they're generating as many teams as people in the LLM conditions. There's no effective incentivizing the LLM conditions. People are already like maxed out in terms of like the reduction in effort that we're doing. So there's no boost, there's no main effect of incentives in the LLM condition. And then in the last study, we really wanted to see whether or not it really matters when you use the LLM, because you could think about in decision making, we often talk about decision making happening through two systems, the system one that's more intuitive and a system two that's more deliberative and corrective. And so we had two stages where people could use an LLM or not. In the first stage, then we offer them another chance to consider more teams with or without an LLM in a between subjects design. And what you see in general is that it doesn't really matter when you use an LLM, it just matters that you use an LLM. So people who use an LLM at any time generated more team names than people who did not use an LLM throughout. Okay, just a couple of robustness checks before I'm out of time. So we find the results hold when we include all participants, not just including people who use an LLM and no LLM conditions. The results hold when controlling for gender. It's not driven by outliers. So if we look across all the studies, the average performance in the LLM condition corresponded to the 60 to the 81st percentile of performance achieved without. So we don't see it just a few people doing better. It's that the average is doing much better than in the LLM condition than in the non-LLM condition. We also see, if we look at total number of accurate hypotheses generated, which is in the triangles, that the results hold. Well, if we just look at total number of accurate hypotheses, it's not necessarily any different than the total number of hypotheses, which is what we use as their primary dependent variable. You also see that the average hypothesis accuracy is pretty similar across LLM and no LLM conditions. So in other words, LLMs are not better at generating accurate hypotheses than our participants. They're just generating more hypotheses, which is why we get more hypotheses and more accurate hypotheses. We also see that, interestingly, people are less confident in the hypotheses that they generate with an LLM than without. And so as a result, they're less calibrated in the accuracy of the hypotheses that they generated. So people are generating good hypotheses with LLMs, they just don't feel as confident in them as if they generated them themselves. And an interesting way that we looked at this, in the third experiment, we asked people to paste their output from the LLM into a box. We basically see that the way that people are using the LLM is they get team names from the LLM, and then they remove teams with which they disagree. People are not adding more names on top of the LLM. They're just saying, like, yeah, the Braves aren't going to make the playoffs, right? Or the Patriots, unfortunately, this year. Okay, so we also see in general that the accuracy of the hypotheses that people generate are contingent on the accuracy of the LLM output. We see variation here because people are using organic prompts, so they're generating their own kinds of prompts. And that has a nice caveat on sort of the boundaries of our effects. But the key findings are that using LLMs increase the total number of hypotheses generated without reducing accuracy. It seems to be a reduction due to a reduction in cognitive effort. So if we pay people, it knocks out the effect. People using LLMs generated similarly accurate hypotheses, but were less confident and calibrated. And using an LLM at any time was good. Some caveats is that we control for knowledge and memory here. So LLMs may have a larger effect with non-experts or domains where people don't have that much information. We also think that LLMs should be less effective if search is rewarding or intrinsic motivation is high. So people want to learn more or excited to learn more, that because it's due to effort, that should be knocked out. When uncertainty is low, so like right before the playoffs, right? And if people are not, if LLMs are inaccurate, people may not adequately vet their responses. So these are some caveats on that. So in summary, we see that LLMs facilitate hypothesis generation because they reduce the effort of hypothesis generation at no cost to accuracy. If people are more skeptical about hypotheses, they generate with and without LLMs. Thank you.
Questions?
Hi, so it'd be very interesting stuff. So you look at accuracy, but can you say anything about like type 1 error, type 2 error, that sequence? Have you looked at that too?
Yeah, we haven't broken it down by hits versus misses. That's a great question. But it'd be interesting to see. Yeah. No. Yeah.
So this is an interesting context of sports. Have you ever considered or explored non-sport categories where people don't have like a personal race and there's not as much, kind of wishful thinking and things like that?
Sure. We have a study that we based on a paradigm by Derek Kohler, who's done some work in this space, where people have to guess the occupation of a person. So it's a single outcome, and we see there that they generate more occupations with the LLM than without, and like they're similarly accurate. So it seems to generalize outside of sports contexts, but we have the tightest data for the sports, so that's what I'm going to show today.
I have a question.
Sure, Pete.
Follow my own rules. Any qualitative insight into why people are skeptical about the LLM predictions?
There's a lot of data showing that people tend to have algorithm aversion, particularly in domains that are relevant to their identity. So if you are a sports fan and if your life is baseball and you are using Google Bard, right, you may be more skeptical of the responses than if you generate them from your infinite wisdom. So it seems like that kind of algorithm aversion is at least carrying over into these sports domains. It's possible that it doesn't generalize outside that. So if you don't necessarily think about that context as being relevant to your identity, but certainly I would think that in many kinds of contexts where this could be applied, like science or medicine or even automotive repair or criminal, forensic work, all of the people who be using this are experts. And so that kind of expertise is something that people care a lot about for themselves. And so I'd expect that skepticism to extend into those kinds of cases too.
Well, thank you, Kurt. Fantastic. Appreciate it.
Thank you.